All right.
Okay, yeah. So if everything works, you should see an IDE now with a project called Bellissima. And this, of course, is just a standard .NET solution. What have I done here? I've created 3 projects. One of them is the web project. This is Umbraco itself. This is what you get when you run the NuGet package called umbraco.templates. As you can see here, I've installed one of the preview versions of Umbraco 14. They are on the feed called, well, in this case, it's the Umbraco Nightly feed. We also have the Umbraco pre-releases feed where they are sort of a bit more stable. We're doing a few previews. We're trying to do one every week from now on, and this is also where the beta will end up next week. I guess we can share the links later to these feeds. There's also a nice tutorial on the documentation about how to get started testing Umbraco 14. And it's essentially the same way you test every new version of Umbraco. So really nothing new there. But in this case, I'm on one of the nightlies just because I like to live dangerously, and doesn't matter that much. We didn't change that many things in the late previews, mostly bug fixes. So what I have here is, well, Umbraco is installed. Haven't really touched much in this project. But I've got 2 other projects, one for my API and one for the client. So these are sort of the necessities of trying to extend Umbraco, I would say. The client folder here is an RCL. So we go into the project file, should be able to see that it's linked to just a forward slash. So any assets served from the root folder of this is accessible just in the root. And in the root folder, I've compiled a package, in this case called mylib. And this package is being picked up by the Umbraco backend. And it will scan for a file called Umbraco package.json. So any folder you put in here that contains an Umbraco package JSON file is really considered an Umbraco package. And this file is where you sort of start the extensions of Umbraco. So you can register any kind of extension through this file, be it a dashboard, a property editor, a menu item, and then a whole new section. So essentially everything you did before with C#, you are now supposed to do either as a manifest or, in this case, I'm going to show you later, as an entry point, which is really just a JavaScript file that's being loaded up front, which also has the possibility to register stuff to the Umbraco backoffice. Yeah, I have the source files in my client folder, so it's a Vite setup. Vite is a compiler, no, sorry, a bundler that supports stuff like TypeScript, and it can put assets and JavaScript files through something called rollup and then bundle them up nicely, so and scrape away any code that's not being used. It's configured to put its files in the root folder. So actually this folder will be replaced every time I run the build. It has 2 entry points as well, just to show that that's doable, but we'll dive into that later. And you can probably see I have the solution running. So if I go to the browser here, you see a browser now, yeah?
Yeah.
Great. So this is the new backoffice actually. And for the keen viewer, they might notice it's not that much different. I mean, we don't have the news dashboard yet built, where you get the latest Umbraco news, but other than that, it's sort of recognizable. You have the top bar still and the menu. And this is really what we wanted to do. So essentially saying when an editor first lay eyes on the new backoffice, if they are going to say, well, it doesn't look any different, then we know we have succeeded, because that's not the goal of changing the UI. The goal was to reinvent the structure behind the back office and make it all work nicely with web components, and actually just get rid of AngularJS. So you could put it as plainly as that. And the whole back office here is built with a library called lit, which sort of lays on top of web components and adds a few nice features. I'll go into that a bit later as well. And it's also now built with TypeScript. So we're actually going to ship a package on NPM with all the types of the back office. So all components you see, all repositories you can import, and all context you can import will come with nice types. And you can run that through the TypeScript compiler and actually know if your package is supposed to work with the back office. So whenever we release a new version, you will immediately know if your build starts failing. I think that's probably one of the biggest wins of this whole project. I know there's been a community effort before trying to type up the old back office, but what they also quickly discover is that it's not very uniform, and you sort of have to focus on either, I don't know, documents or something like that, a special cutout of everything just to have basic typings, and it's not been that great to work with, to be honest. So we're doing that, and it's one of the headlines. So web components, TypeScript, and a new API. That's essentially the new back office. Now, I don't know. That's sort of my intro of V14. Before we started recording, I was talking about extensions as well and packages in Umbraco, and I can just quickly show we have the marketplace of Umbraco going, so you can easily find new wonderful packages in here. And of course, we hope that all of these packages will eventually be migrated to V14, so they get a nice V14 tag, and hopefully sooner rather than later. So as soon as you can start on your own packages, even just extensions on that you're doing for your clients, that could be custom property editors or dashboards or anything like that. We'd really like to see that starting. Yeah, and the beta will be out next week on Wednesday, March the 6th, and we hope that people will start using it, really. Yeah, and I pulled up 2 pull requests just for a bit of old time's sake. That's sort of the milestones, you could say. 2 days ago, we merged this one. So 2,600 files changed, 200,000 lines of code gone in one pull request. And we now don't have the old back office anymore on the V14 branch. That's really, really nice milestone, I would say. And there's been a lot of dependencies on the old back office, even just static files lying around that we didn't know that other things pulled in from the back office. We had to find a new home for those. But it's just, yeah, can't say how wonderful it is to see something like this actually take place. So there's now only one way forward, and that is to get the new back office working. Just for those of you who don't know, this old back office was first created in, I believe, 2012 and then released in 2013 in Umbraco 7. It was at the time codenamed Bell, so from Italian. And that makes it around 11 years old now. At the time, it was built with AngularJS 1.1, and when Umbraco 8 shipped a few years later, it was then upgraded to AngularJS 1.5, I believe, and then it followed sort of the last AngularJS versions. And of course, AngularJS has been end of life for, I believe, a year now, 2 years now, something like that. So it's about time we ship something new, we thought. Another big change was, of course, this pull request as well. Got some attention on LinkedIn today. Macros is now also gone. So I guess I forgot to mention that before. It's sort of also a breaking change. But of course, we don't remove a feature like this without having an alternative. And what people really used macros for was either in the rich text editor to insert essentially a partial view, or in the block grid or the grid layout and the old, what was it called, grid layout editor. So the old kind of grid, people put in macros there as well, essentially getting partial views into other stuff. So it's all been replaced now with blocks. The grid layout has actually for long been end of life and replaced with the block grid. And now I believe was it in 13 we shipped that? You can now insert blocks in the rich text editor as well. So obsoleting macros, you could say. And blocks, of course, also have a backing of partial view. But what's really neat about blocks is that they are structured data, whereas macros was just really an HTML snippet that pointed to an alias that you could then point to a partial view, which you can imagine didn't work really well in a headless API. So when we wanted to build the content delivery API from Umbraco in V12, we had to kind of figure out how to replace macros. So initially it just scraped away the macros and when you requested a rich text editor through the content delivery, because you can't really resolve a partial view in JSON. And if you could, I mean, you still lack the context that the partial view was rendered in. So yeah, not gonna fly. But blocks is structured data, so it's just content types and document types, element types being rendered, and they work really nicely in JSON, as you can imagine. So two really huge milestones for V14. And so
yeah, that's awesome, man. Yeah, nice one.
So this is what we got, and with that, it's I can't stress it enough. But Umbraco is of course moving towards more headless future, and with a content delivery API and a management API, and Umbraco Hardcore moving towards the same APIs and supporting the same schemas. This is what we want to do, and then of course the new client here is built entirely independent of the backend. So as Mike was saying from the start, again, before we started recording, you could now essentially host a back office instance somewhere else and then point it toward a Umbraco backend server. So you could have one back office serving multiple backends essentially. And we could, for instance, ourselves imagine using that for the hardcore product. So having one back office instance to serve all of those backends would be wonderful. Yeah. Anyway.
Very cool. Very, very cool. Have you had? I guess where it's not really been formally released to the public yet. Not one of the big things about Umbraco is its open source nature and everyone has the ability to jump in and contribute. Has there been any, have people started adding their own contributions to the back office now? And has there been any sort of, have there been any, where I'm going with this? So there's a big change between V13 and V14 when you're working with the back office from a contribution and a collaborative perspective. I'd be keen to know how big a change is it? So for example, if I was to pull down the back office, I know there's a few repos you've now got to work with and sort of locating. If we want to get involved and say, help you, get this over the line, what's the best way for us to get started in helping with that?
Yeah, so I think you're asking a few questions at the same time,
yeah.
Which is okay, of course. Let me see if I can untangle a bit. So this is the repo on GitHub that the back office is running in. Usually we have the big repo here on Umbraco CMS, where currently the back office also resides. In the development phase, at least, we chose to go with another repository to keep, because there's a massive amount of issues and pull requests, as you can imagine, and we wanted to keep that isolated. So this is also where people have been trying to contribute. But what actually happened there on the main tracker was we started issuing a label saying I believe it's called deferred to new back office or deferred to Bellissima. So whenever someone tries to do a feature request or a pull request from, I guess a few months ago, we started putting on that label and referring them to the new back office and actually letting them know that they were free to contribute on to that back office as well. And well, I'm sorry to say not many people have taken us up on that offer. There's been a few well-known people in the community doing that. I guess you can see a few of them here. But of course, we all know this guy, right? He's been very active, and there's been a few others. So yeah, we have seen a bit of activity, but I wholeheartedly expect that to increase as we release the beta.
Yeah, exciting. Oh, Carl's got a question.
Yeah, fire away.
Oh, we can't hear you, Carl.
I apologize. Yeah, I just realised. What was your choice and reason for using lit rather than say like a Vue or React or something like that? Because obviously you've got to then deal with the styling issue, not being able to use style sheets because everything has to be injected in. So obviously you've got the shallow DOM issue that you inherently get with web components rather than rendered stuff. So what was your choice behind that?
Yeah, I guess the easy answer is to say the choice was taken before I joined HQ. But no, it's we really wanted something that isn't going to be obsoleted anytime soon. I mean, rewriting the back office is a huge undertaking, probably the biggest one Umbraco as a company has ever done since building the CMS itself, right? And the old back office has seen many iterations where it sort of started with a simple UI and then people added to it whenever they needed something. And obviously Umbraco has increased in complexity over the last, 11 years since the first version of that back office came out. And so the story goes, they built that back office in a weekend, right? And then essentially shipped that more or less. And well, maybe a bit longer, but they had a prototype going in a weekend. And that's all it took at the time because you didn't have much in the back office, not as much as today. And so imagine doing this every, let's say 10 years is also something we're not interested in. So we took a look at the market and sort of went, okay, what could be more native to the browser, and web components was kind of the obvious answer here. So web components spawned out of a need for, as you saw, several front-end frameworks being launched and taking off and then dying eventually. And well, I can see why the browsers came together and started creating an API for all of that. And what you then have is the Web Components API, which consists of a Web Components concept, which consists of two APIs. So there's the Custom Elements API, that is actually what you know from something like Vue or React or Angular, where you can create a component and then spin it up in your HTML. And then there's the Shadow DOM API, which is then isolated from the others, whereas they also support it. You can in AngularJS, you can also scope your styles, and I believe that's possible in Vue as well. And so they sort of invented their own way of doing that, and that's now also native in the browser. And when we set out to build essentially software on the web, it's really important to us that software looks the same, works the same across whole bunch of browsers, even though when you install packages, that they don't inherently break anything simply because everything is so open. So web components with Shadow DOM fit right into that narrative, allowing us to support it and to promise more stability and maintainability on our back office code. So I guess that's sort of the long version of the answer. We did a series of RFCs in this regard as well. I believe we did up to 4 RFCs. The first one sort of outlined the whole project, saying, okay, what stages do we need to go through to come up with a new back office? And that RFC ended more or less saying, there's a UI component in all of this that we need to isolate. So that went on and became the UI library, which we then shipped last year. And then another component was extensions, and that went on to become the extensions API. And so that's sort of still a bit muddy on where extensions API end and back office begins. But you can say the back office as such, if you launch that without extensions, would just be a blue bar and a gray screen.
Gotcha.
So everything else is extensions. And then there's a core to it that supports the structure, which is then the back office root or back office client, back office app, we call it in the source code. And then I believe the third sort of milestone on that was then the implementation of the back office itself. And then for each of these 3 stages, we did an additional RFC to detail what was supposed to happen in those. So already in the UI library, we ended up doing with lit and web components because we knew we wanted to do that with the back office, so it makes sense to align already on there. And another benefit of that was we were able to use the UI library in our other products. So when you go to the cloud portal, for instance, that's also built with the UI library now. And that allows us to share the whole UI landscape across all Umbraco products. So we have one team that is my team maintaining that. And so the other teams don't have to worry that much about UI details. We'll make sure we follow our design guidelines and yada, yada, everything. And that then also allowed us to build a new back office. And of course, that had to be with web components as well. So another 2 components that sort of came in between all of that was that, one, how do we then handle external extensions? That would be the extensions you're making for your clients or for your packages. If you want to build your own property editor. And we had to say, okay, we won't force you to choose anything specific. So if we choose web components, we don't want you to have to use web components. So we need a way in between, but still we need some kind of element to spin up, right? So when you, I guess I can show it here, like this is a property, right? So the element that's spun up here or here, this is actually a custom property editor I built. The shell of that has to be a web component. So that was the compromise. It doesn't have to be a lit web component, what's also called a lit element. It can just be a native costume element, and which is called an HTML element. So anything you put in there, we don't actually care about. But you have to work with the browser for us. So when you set a value, you have to dispatch an event that we can listen on. So it has to have a certain name, right? So there are a few compromises in there, but I think they make sense. Whereas with AngularJS, if you wanted to set a value on a property editor, you actually had to do it through AngularJS scope, so the scope variable. And of course, you can share that with any web components, any other components, but it's really messy, I think. And AngularJS is what's it called, where it checks if anything's changed. That doesn't really, that doesn't really work if you start messing about with it, right? But events are native in a browser, and in fact, Angular in their Angular 2.0 version, like what we also call modern Angular, also switched to events. So they go like properties in, events out, and that actually allowed them to also come up with something they call Angular element, which is just them spitting out web components. And they follow the same structure. Yeah. So you could actually do that. You could put in the new version of Angular and set it to spit out web components, and that would just work more or less here. React has a way to do it. Vue has a way to do it. Svelte has a way to do it. That's also seen popularity in recent years. So it's a very agnostic approach. I actually expect one of the first packages to be a wrapper for AngularJS, just to bring it back into the back office to annoy us, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I bet you're probably liking the abstraction levels, right, that you get with web components, because obviously everything can be completely isolated then, can't it? And you've already said that when you said about the Umbraco Cloud stuff. That's what I've always quite liked about it. I've used some of those we're currently rebuilding our website at the moment, and I chose to use a lot of lit for that reason, because then we can enable us to share it. It's all like then, very modular, and it all gives you that high level of abstraction that you need, which is quite nice. So the question, obviously, you mentioned it earlier. You mentioned about a component registry. Is that going to be for how we're going to register our new web components in that, and then they get registered and then displayed in here, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And actually, the isolation is really interesting. If I just go and inspect this, as I mentioned before, this is my own component. So I call it my property editor. It's a custom element. But inside, I'm actually using a UUI input and a UUI button. So I don't care how they look. I just care about their functionality. But using those directly from the UI library allows me to be sure that my UI actually looks good, works good, is accessible, built in, and just gives me a very native feeling of the back office. And whereas before I may have had to put on certain classes or anything like that, I can now just plug in the components and they already look good and work well. So it's all abstracted away, and I can also be sure that whatever CSS I put on my property editor won't affect the button. So if I wanted to style buttons inside my property editor, I wouldn't hit this because it's all abstracted away. So really wonderful with Shadow DOM. There's a few properties that do penetrate the boundaries of the Shadow DOM, though. One of them is the font size. So if you like you had an inline component, you kind of want that to go along with your font size. So that's sort of crosses the boundary. Another one is the color. So the text color can cross the boundary as well. So there's a few of them, but really I think it's a nice API. We already in V13, so the one that shipped in December, we re-implemented the login screen using web components. So wanted to test that out for a wider audience and to learn something about how people are going to use it. I mean, the few first issues we've seen with that is people, as I mentioned, that from the start, they were able to plug in a random JavaScript, a random CSS, and just style everything to look like their own homemade CMS. And they can't do that anymore. But still, we made a few compromises, and especially Warren was a great help with that, instructing us how you could potentially wish to customize the login screen. So we implemented a lot of either properties you can set either through your server settings or CSS. So using the CSS custom properties, which is variables in CSS, they also cross the boundary of Shadow DOM. So we can hook onto that as if they are set, we'll use your value, or otherwise we'll fall back to one of our values. So that could be the background image of the login screen, and it could be the text color. Yeah, so there's a whole list on the documentation about that, and we'll probably end up with the same conundrum in the back office itself, because people used to be able to do everything in here, right? So we have to figure out how to do all of that, styling wise.
That's cool. I saw that you had the CSS variables inside of there as well. So that'd be sick. We can always override them like that. I know that you can pay. I can't remember the CSS for it now, but I know you can style the inner elements of a shadow if you do it on the. it's like a pseudo element that you can apply on it. I can't remember what it was now, but it was the only way I could get around doing that. But I ended up implementing classes on top of it, because you can get those when you're inside the lit element as well. So I ended up having them as like, I used them BEM naming conventions. So when I needed to apply something to it,
Oh
I
yeah.
then just had them as modifiers and then just pulled it into that because I wasn't using modular CSS at the time. So my CSS was external, because I was sort of doing a mix at the time as I was sort of learning about lit when I was implementing it. But I think now I'd probably use like a, you have it as a CSS object, don't you, in JavaScript, and then you just basically plumb them around. So I'd probably just do something similar and then base it on the CSS variables like you've got there, to be fair.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that should make it customizable enough anyway for people. Do you know what I mean? You can just add those in your route and then override them, can't you? So that'd be nice enough.
Yeah,
Wicked. No, thanks a lot for explaining that.
There's already a lot of UI variables you can override.
Yeah.
So everything namespaced or prefixed, which is sort of a namespace with UI, comes from that library. And then there's also some UMB variables that then belongs to the back office. You'll also start seeing that with components itself. So some of them will have the UMB prefix and others UI. It really depends which library they come from. And sometimes we'll have to extend the UI components a bit to make them work in the back office. But that's because we wanted the UI library to be very abstract, very agnostic, and not know anything about the back office. And then when it comes to back office, we would rather extend them a little bit, or set some variables. So that's what we've been trying to do. So I can just go and show, we now use Storybook as well. We started with the UI library that's here. So all components in the back office that's you can find here, and UI library is actually already available since version 11. Version 10, I think we actually managed to ship it in, but it's keep getting updated in with the current back office as well. Although it's a bit chunky to work with AngularJS and web components, but you can make it work. So it's there, and of course everything in the new back office is built with that. And there's a nice storybook I find where you can play around with setting different ones. Like if you can't remember the colors of the buttons, you can
that's cool. I like that.
Try it out. We even built some designs, I think some examples here, some compositions as well. Like this is how, it's actually the back office here, sort of just implemented very crudely. So this is a demonstration of composition of several components. So you could actually build this UI with only the UI library. I think there's a login screen here as well. Here we go, a box. So really, and it's there are a few libraries like this out there. I know Adobe is making one, and there's been some other open source one as well, and we've tried to align a bit with what they're doing, but also we have some very Umbraco specific things in here, like cards, I believe. So how would we actually render a block? So the UI library knows about that, but it doesn't go any further than this. It's just these are all extensions of the card component, which doesn't do much, as you can see. But we went ahead and built something like, so you could preview media like this, and imagine that in a grid layout, right, of images. And then we took that on to the back office. So we actually have Storybook for V14 as well. Let me just quickly go and show you the 13 one, so you know what you're missing. This is how you would figure out what UI elements is available in Umbraco 13, with nice code examples, but not really much else. And I mean, some of it is documented. I even saw a reference to Umbraco 7 there. You have some services and resources. So and this is something called, I believe, ngdoc. So it supports Angular and just figures out the documentation there. But anyway, since we don't have AngularJS anymore, we went ahead and used Storybook instead. And it's still crude, so it's unfair to compare with the old one, which was actually rather complete with documentation. But Storybook gives us insane capabilities of documenting stuff with Markdown as well, and putting in stories in the middle of Markdown. So we have Warren's nice component here, the debug element. He actually contributed that when, and we can put in images and code examples. And the layout is, of course, the same as the UI library, but now it's back office specific components. You can actually figure out what they are about. And we'll try to make some examples of how, for instance, a property editor looks like. I mean, no, this is not, oh, sorry, this is not the nicest example, right? But we are actually using this as a development tool as well. So when we build stuff, we want to put it in isolated and just do, okay, the UI of this, how is that going to work? And then we'll put it into the wider perspective of the back office later on. And we can even add the UI library to this one. So the whole storybook of UI library is also in here. And it actually pulls that in from the other storybook. So not everything is supported like plugins for storybook wise, but it loads. I mean, and you can play around with it. So yeah, I don't know if that's probably not wired up. Yeah, so documentation wise, it's going to be a lot nicer. But
yeah, definitely.
I see that I might lose myself a bit in all of this. If maybe I should try and show a bit of the actual extension system.
Yeah, that'd be
that'd
wicked.
really cool.
Yeah, cool, man.
So one of the things I've liked so much about all this so far is how I remember talking to Phil about this years ago, about the move to a more standards-based approach, and it's really starting to show the sort of power of that now, with it all sort of being split up. But anyway, yeah, I'm excited to see how the extensions work.
Yeah. So we've got the package file, as I mentioned. It has, you can put in all extensions here. So everything you see in the UI is sort of extendable. I don't know if I even have typing for it. I might have here IntelliSense. Does that pop-up menu show up here? Yeah. So
yeah, it does. Yeah.
So we actually have IntelliSense for this file, and you can go on your own little discovery tour and figure out what you can register here. But like menus and property actions, even themes to the back office, workspace views. So yeah, I should mention we also changed the naming of a few things. I believe everything was just called an editor in the current back office, the old back office. Like no matter what you saw, it's just an editor. Doesn't matter if it was the whole view or like the editor itself, or like your property editor, just call it an editor. So we went ahead and tried and changed that a bit. So the editor view, you saw the page itself is now called a workspace, and it has views. So the little buttons on the right top corner, they're called views. You can register those as well. And yeah, you'll sort of list views are called collections now, and they also have views, which could be the grid or the table view. So you can register those as well through this. But I went ahead and registered an entry point, which doesn't take much. It has an alias and a name just so we can recognize this and not register the same thing twice. And then it points to a JavaScript file. The JavaScript file has to be the output path. So it's not the source path, but where it ends up in my output. So everything is flat there, and that's where it ends up. But it builds from the main TS file in this case. Mm-hmm. And an entry point simply has to export a function, which is the UMB entry point on init interface. So we see we already import that from one of the namespaces of Umbraco. So I have the npm package installed, and so I already get IntelliSense here as well as to what I can import from this package. And It's important to say you need your bundler to consider the Umbraco CMS backoffice namespace as external, so it needs to leave the imports there because we are using ECMAScript modules. So that means that these imports actually work in the browser directly as with native JavaScript through what is called an import map. So if you inspect the source of the new backoffice, you'll see a big JSON array of import maps that points to files that we have lying around. And so every time you do an import, it actually loads that file. But so you'll use the exact same entry points as we're using. So we have these sort of imports all over the back of the source code. Then my init function receives two parameters, a host, that's the backoffice element itself, and then the extensions registry. And it's just an instance of the registry. So what I can do with that is, for instance, register my own manifests, it's called, in this case, a localization file. So I add my own variables to the English American language or culture. I also register the property editor. I believe that's the one you saw before. It's registered like this. Everything has a dynamic import, it's called in JavaScript. So a factory function that returns an import. So it's only loading the file when I actually have to see the property editor on the page.
It's wicked. I was just going to ask that it's dynamically loaded. Oh, wicked.
Yeah,
Cool.
exactly. So it uses the alias to figure out when to load the file, actually.
Wicked.
And yeah, in the current backoffice, we had something called what was called lazy load JS, which sort of worked similarly. If you knew how it worked, you could add your own scripts to it, but any property editors had to be loaded up front because the AngularJS worked through the HTML file instead. So you already needed a controller to be loaded, and you could only really delay the HTML file itself. But now we can delay the whole thing. So this just exports a web component, and I'll go into that in a minute. So it contains the whole template and script and whatnot. And then there's a few meta options. So these will look similar to you if you're used to register your own property editors in the current backoffice. The only real difference is now everything is in an extensions array, whereas the old backoffice had a property editors array and a dashboards array and a few others, and then you couldn't register them any more than that. And now it's here. I have a dashboard as well, and even a modal, so an overlay of some kind that opens up. So by registering it like this, I can actually I could open it up from any kind of extension, even letting other extensions open my modal by this. Well, we'll see if we have time to go into that. What more do I have? I'm configuring my generated API. So I have an API controller running, which I then run through a JSON to TypeScript generator, and that put in all of these auto-generated files in the API folder here. So I have a lot of I have a service called time resource because my API it's a time controller, and that gives me an open API configuration that I just have to configure with a few things such as the token and the base URL of the backoffice. And so I'm actually pulling those out of the backoffice itself. So whenever the backoffice authenticates, I hook onto that and just pull out the token. This is not the token itself, but the token factory. Cool. It'll just invoke that whenever I do request through my own generated resources. And there's a whole host of JSON JSON schema to TypeScript generators out there. So it doesn't really matter which you use, but I know there was a discussion on Discord just today about like some of them don't really work with OpenAPI. And so, that's not really something we can do anything about, but there might be something to consider. At least the one we are using, we're comfortable with. And if you use that as well, you can hook on exactly to our configuration. So that will probably be our recommendation, as well as, people have asked us our people have really just told us to give them orders to what to use. So if we are using lit, they want to use lit, and if we use TypeScript, they want to use TypeScript. Yeah. So the whole aspect of bringing your own library hasn't really caught on to many people yet. But I mean, lit is a nice library. So
yeah, exactly. No, it is. It's quite nice actually. To be fair, yeah.
Yeah. And it's like 5 kilobytes at runtime if you ship your
That's
own.
it.
You can even use our
Yeah.
version of lit. Of course, then your components might also break when we update it. But yeah, it's like it's 5 kilobytes to your
Yeah,
JavaScript.
it's well good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the dynamic import stuff. That's awesome that you can do that as well. I see you're registering several components in this one registration, right? So obviously that's free. You just add them to the registry. They'll just become part of that main namespace that you've put in the other one as the my.extensions, right?
Yeah, but
Or
really
sorry,
all
my.package or
manifests
whatever.
just sort of have their own alias, and that works
Yeah,
globally.
okay.
Yeah. So it
Okay,
doesn't
okay.
matter much where they're registered. They're not scoped to anything really.
Oh, fine. Okay.
Yeah. So if you load up a component, I mean, anyone can use that because Costume Elements is a global registry in the browser. At least so far it is. They are working on scoping that as well. So we might look into
Okay.
that when that feature lands in the major browsers. So you'll actually, currently if you register something called UMB button, you'll get an error because we already use that alias,
Yeah.
So that could be something to look into. But anyway, what do we go into then? So I really wanted to show the API itself, but also the front end stuff. Let's see if we have time. What's the time? We have like 20 minutes left or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, 20 minutes.
Yeah. So this is the property edits I was showing before. Just a quick glance at web components. So this is a lit element. It extends the lit element class, which is in this case gets from lit itself. So I'm actually using my version of lit, not the back office version, but I could have used that as well. But lit element itself is an extension on HTML element. So if I wanted to build a completely native web component, I could have done that as well. And as you see, there's a mixin here called UMB element mixin. So mixins is a way to extend from several classes in JavaScript. You wrap a mixin and it takes in a parameter of the next thing to extend. So you can it's functional programming, right? You can extend from, you have cases in the URL library with like 5 mixins. But we just ship the one here in backoffice, which gives you a few methods. That's nice to work with. I don't know if I can go into, yeah. So there's from the top, an observe method that allows you to observe on observables. It's no secret we're using RxJS in the back office, but we have been trying to abstract that away a bit. So people can just, use observe, because if we wanted to change that out at some point, we didn't want people to be too caught up on it. So we did a lot of extensions.
Do you reckon you might swap that to promises or something like that? Or like, well, sorry, no, that's for, okay, yeah,
I mean,
okay.
They have obvious advantages being observable. I mean, keep getting new values. So that's the whole state system of Umbraco. It's also built in. You can do, we build a concept of stores, which is a state machine, and everything is just observable through that. And then we build a whole host of functions around that to create array states, object states, and you can freeze them so no one else can modify them. And it's just, really try to abstract it away a bit. But anyway, you use this observe method. So on any view elements, you can observe from any observable. And the benefit is that this subscription will then get canceled when your component leaves the DOM. So you don't have to handle any of that. Yeah. Otherwise, what we saw in the current back office is a huge performance hit with AngularJS. When you do magic with scopes, you can do scope.watch. That was actually okay. I think sort of auto cleaned that, but if you did root scope.watch or anything like that, you had to remember to clean that yourself. So you can actually just go into the back office and go into the profile of something like Chrome and see the listeners array just increasing and increasing as you click around the back office. So
Right,
yeah, you have to refresh once in a while, I think. It should be taken care of using this. Then there's the provide and consume context. So one of the other things that sort of came up when we did the RFCs was we needed a way to ship a context from component to component without doing what is known as prop drilling. So when you send the context to one component, which sends to its next component and so on, 3, 4, 5 levels deep, you have to remember that's really hard to maintain. So a context is a way to say, okay, here's an object, I don't care who gets it. And then anything below that can consume it using an alias, which can either be a string or a token, and they get exactly that object.
Oh, okay. So you've got like a central store basically for your props effectively.
Yeah. So anytime you consume something, it sends out an event with the alias and saying, okay, anything wants to respond to this, and then it gets a callback when something does that. And the beauty of it is that you can also override our contexts. I believe I keep going back to this nice example of the notification context, which is a way to show notifications in the back office. So really globally, you can have a pop-up saying something happened. What if you wanted that notification to pop up within a confinement, like say a sidebar or a modal or something? But you didn't want any extensions to care about where they got the extension from. So you can just go and override that context in between, say, okay, I know what I'm doing here, so I'll take over. And then you provide the context with the same alias, and any consumers below that will then get the new context, but they don't care about that. I mean, they won't be the wiser because they just have to, consume it, and the consume is a callback. And as long as you like reset your state every time you get a callback, you're good to go, right? So you'll use the same API of notifications, but they'll show up somewhere entirely different. Then the last one is localized. So it's really a controller which you could have newed up manually on your own components, but we thought it would be really central for people to use localization. So it's a way for you to pull in strings from the language files. So it has I believe, can I actually go to it here? Yeah, that's something like term. So that's give it a key and you'll get the value in the language you're in, date, number, relative time even. They're using the new INTL API of the browser. So also trying that out. Sort of to be native and not having to pull in something like moment.js, anything big like that. But those are the ones you get on mixins, and this is really how you then provide an element to Umbraco. So back to the property editor, right? I'm extending this because this makes it act like a controller, although I'm not using the values, but it's just nice to be in the same like element landscape of the other elements of the back office. I'm also implementing the property editor UI element interface, which allows me to know that I can set a value. I can get a value property, and I can just render that property in my input field. So this would be the actual value that's stored in the database. It also allows me I can now use get and set on, that's just native JavaScript. So whenever I set a new value, I have to dispatch this event. It has to have the name property value change, but I actually believe we have a built-in class for this, so you don't have to remember to spell it correctly. We are really keen on not using magic strings anywhere. But I forgot to use that apparently. So this is really a property editor is really just value in, value out, right? There's also another one
Yeah.
called config. So anything you configured on the property editor is also something you can get here and act upon. But I'm not that advanced in this property editor. The keen eye might notice it's called a property editor UI. So what is a UI? Well, it's really the UI of the property editor. It has it's how to say, the other side of the coin is a schema. So a property editor schema. That's what's registered on the server. So we split that into two now with the new backoffice. Beforehand, you only had property editors, and they could either have, they could have a pre-value view and a property editor view. So the pre-value is the one you saw in the configuration, and the view was the one you saw in the editor itself. But really, why?
You had to implement both, didn't you?
Yeah. So, but why? Why, you can ask? I mean, it's just, I mean, if you want to do default configuration of something simple like some text and some choices, and why not just do that in JSON instead, and then use default views? And then, in fact, why not allow property editor UIs to be used for configuring as well? So you only have the one view. But then, of course, that leaves you with something missing. You need the server component of this. So when you register what is still called a data editor on the backend, you put in an alias to that, and you have to do a counterpart in the front end of that schema, so with the same alias. But it doesn't have to hold any configuration, but it can. And so if I had invented my own data editor in the backend with its own property value converter and stuff like that, I would just register it here using let's see if we have IntelliSense or property. Oh, maybe I don't in this one. I don't have IntelliSense. I had that before. IDs. Okay, it's called property editor schema. So I'll register that, and then you'll see for the UI registration, there's actually a meta property called property editor schema alias, and that has to point to my data editor. But in this case, I don't have a data editor. I'm using one of the built-in ones of Umbraco, the text box one. And this is my whole registration of the property editor. I actually didn't include settings. So settings, that's a way for you to do configuration, what's also called properties. And you can then, sorry, that's an array actually. You can do properties which has an alias and some config and a description that shows up in the UI, and a property editor UI alias, which then tells it what to render. But this is all bound on the UI. But there can also be configuration bound on the schema, so that's actually shareable between several UIs. And a really good example of that is the rich text editor. So the rich text schema has some nice defaults, like do I don't know, replace HTML elements, or where do I put my dropped images, in which folder do they go? And any UI will then inherit those configurations. So we build a UI for TinyMCE, so it's called something like Umbraco Rich Text Property Editor UI TinyMCE, something large like that. But if you wanted to build your own rich text editor, you will just hook on to our schema for rich text, so you'll do the same value conversion, but using your own UI. It's really neat. If I just quickly go back to the UI here, if we find my data type, so that's the now let's create a new one. So if I wanted to take my property editor and then create a data type around it, let's see, I would then, what did I call it? My property editor. You see here the settings I have here in the background. That's from the label, because that's the default one. But when I change that here, it's now called maximum allowed characters. But I didn't configure that anywhere here. So that actually comes from the text box, because the text box has a built-in one for maximum allowed characters. So a really neat feature. I actually inherit that, and I can immediately, if I had implemented the config attribute in my component, I could actually access that as well. So that's it's just a gotcha about property editors. Probably one of the bigger changes we did out there that will cause the breaking changes around here and there.
Yeah, fair
you
enough.
can see the relationship here. My property editor
Yeah.
uses Umbraco text box, so still UI work in progress maybe, but it shows the data at least.
No, it's nice. At least you get to see the relationship of what's inherited by that, which is
Yeah,
quite
yeah,
nice at a glance without having to like dive behind the scenes.
yeah.
That's not. I don't mind that personally, but anyway, yeah. No, that's really cool, man. Yeah, it's wicked. I like that. Yeah, different way of working. Obviously, it's a lot more like sort of front end technology
Yeah,
based with
yeah,
obviously JavaScript and TypeScript and stuff. But I mean, the fact you're giving away type definitions though is going to be so helpful anyway. That'll be a lot of documentation just right there. And
yeah,
then
yeah,
obviously like TypeScript's fine anyway. So that's quite cool. And then obviously you're using Vita, I think it is, in it, or Vita, whatever how you
yeah, yeah.
pronounce it.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, cool, man. Yeah, I like
Yeah,
that. You know, I've only used Parcel myself, is the one I've been pretty keen on. But I've heard
yeah.
lots of people using Vite before. I just haven't dived into it yet.
Yeah, I mean, Vita is really just a fancy configuration of rollup, so you can also just use
Yeah.
rollup yourself. Uses ES build as well, which is a nice bundle tool or compiler tool built in Rust, but really fast.
All right.
So it'll take that TypeScript and make it into JavaScript in no time.
It is
Oh,
insanely
nice.
fast. It's very
Yeah,
cool.
Oh, really? All right, cool.
Yeah.
but you can
Yeah.
use that manually as well, ES build. I mean, if you wanted to. So yeah, really, I mean, we build our tutorials up around using Vite just to have common ground. So people will most likely use
Yeah.
that. And we've seen blog posts starting coming out with this setup exactly like this, with the main file or entry point. Because as I said, you could register everything directly here, but it'll quickly also get out of hand, I think. And if you wanted to do something more conditional, like only register your dashboard if a certain user logged in, you could do that more easily here with JavaScript. So that's also something doable now.
Yeah, cool.
I have the host element. I can consume any context of the back office. That includes like the current user, which language am I on? Yeah, just everything that's available. I could consume here. In this case, I showed before, I'm only consuming the auth context. So whenever the back office logs in, authorizes, or authenticates, I can then get the configuration of that. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
nice.
anyway, just I know you're a bunch of .NET people all around, so why don't we also take a look at some C#, shall we?
Yeah, go for it. We got a few minutes.
Yeah. I have the API project here, and has a composer that just, I believe, registers my own documentation in Swagger. I have my own security as well, which just extends the back office security, so I can log in with the big authorize button in Swagger, and I'll use that, hook onto that. And then I define some constants just for which version and what my API is called. And I started building an API controller base. So you'll immediately notice here, it's just ASP.NET Core, extending the controller, marking it as an API controller. And then we start seeing the attributes I mentioned before. So I want to map it to a certain version, to a certain API, so it shows up in my namespace. And then here I'm hooking on to the back office authorization policies. So I'm just saying here, anyone that has access to the back office itself may call on these controllers. You might notice there's a new keyword here. That's now that we removed the old back office, we can also remove the new keyword everywhere. But I'm using an older preview, so I have to use that for now. Yeah, I built my own attribute as well, just to say, okay, I want all my URLs to start with this /Bellissima thing, and then hook on to that. And so my first controller is called time controller, and it creates a group, and then actually just returns regular action results. And if I still have it running, if I do Umbraco /Swagger, I'll see it here immediately. So my Bellissima management API, that's my own. I can also see Umbraco's management API. So that would be all the controllers that the backoffice itself is using. Let's get rid of that. So you see there's a lot and a lot of models. So all data on Umbraco controllable there. There's also the delivery API from V12. And then my own. And so I took this path here, the Open API schema, and then I put it into my generator. So we're talking about before. I'll just quickly show it. I have it in my package.json file. I set it up as a script generate. It'll call with an input of this very URL and then an output and essentially a few options. And all of that gives me the API folder here with, if I dive into it, the time resource, which has exactly two functions, which resembles the ones you see here, status and time, and already ready to call. And I do believe I'm actually calling one of them. Let's see, from my dashboard here, my time dashboard. So this is also just a web component, blah, blah, blah. It has a render method. That's what lit gives us on top of web components. And it checks the client time and then calls the server time. And it does that through the time resource.get APIs. This is auto-generated function name, and I wrapped that in one of our helper methods called try, execute, and notify, which will listen to any API errors and show a nice notification if it fails, and otherwise just gives you some data if it gets some data. And that's again, we can see it here in action as well, my time dashboard. So this is the server response. Should actually be able to see it in the network. Tab here, time, preview. Yeah, there we go. A string. So, I mean, from if you define your controllers all right and use standard attributes, there's also some more Swagger-like attributes, and particularly this one is very useful. Produces response type that goes directly into the OpenAPI document, and then will that translate into TypeScript interfaces as well.
Cool.
If you use that, I mean, you're already a long way ahead of everyone, right? You just generate the schema, and you already get some resources you can call directly from the front end. And all of these are just static methods, so they're really just callable everywhere, and they hook onto this global object OpenAPI. You might recognize this from my main file. That's the one I configured here, OpenAPI. So there's the link between everything. But in behind all of it is just a fetch call. So you could also just use the fetch API yourself, or if you're used to Axios, you could use that. You just have to configure it with the token function, but this is just a factory function. So really, you can just get the token out of this function and put into whatever you want, and it'll start using the function, the token in the header. So OAuth, let's see the request here. Where's the, sorry, go away. We have the authorization here, yeah. So it inherits the token of the others. Like, so these
really
should
nice
be
seeing it.
the same tokens. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice seeing it all connecting together.
Yeah.
Very, very cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Nice. Does anyone have any questions for Jacob?
No, that's awesome though.
Just looking through the chat, so I saw Warren putting up a few, but I think some of them have been answered as we've been going along. I was one around block list and block grids have the same underlying data schema. So UI for block grid and one for block list, if I understand this correctly. I'm not sure if I had the context of that.
No,
or
it's
if I
probably
good.
back to the split between UIs and schemas if they share the same. I mean, it could make sense that they do, but I'm actually not sure if they do.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Jacob. That was really, really good. I think
Yeah,
we can
more-
probably stop recording now if we want, unless there's any
And
other.
there's also a question
points.
about the difference between an entry point extension and a bundle extension.
Yes.
Yeah. So I believe entry points is exactly a file that exports this function I was talking about, the on-init function, whereas the bundle is a combination of several files. So everything in the back office is registered as a bundle, in fact. So like the log viewer, that would be a bundle. Yeah.
Hope that answers the question for whoever answered it. I'm just having a look through the chat. I can't remember who it was. Cool. No, awesome. Thank you very much. Does anyone have anything else to add? I'm gonna take that as a no. Cool. Well, if everyone's happy with that, I'm happy with leaving it there. Thanks once again, Jacob, and to all of you who joined us tonight.
Thank you,
Lovely
Jake.
seeing you all.
Thank you.
Jacob.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
been
cheers
my
so much.
pleasure.
Thanks, really good.
Cheers.